Hello, Brave Souls. Tonight I've got the second part of that AI generated zombie story that I had started the other day, so let's get right into part 2. Chapter 2: Descent into Madness. It didn't take long for things to completely spiral out of control. As wild and unhinged as their first patient was, he was just the creepy calm before the storm. Within the hour, the ambulance bay was a full blown madhouse. Rigs were pulling in left and right, unloading patient after patient showing those same disturbing symptoms. By 7 a.m., the ER waiting room looked like one of those doomsday cult compound raids gone wrong. Delirious people in varying states of undress, some lying eerily still while others thrashed and convulsed, all displayed that terrifying thousand-yard stare. Of course, at first, we thought it must be some kind of isolated viral outbreak. Too many cases presenting at once for it to just be random. Maybe a super strain of influenza or measles gone haywire in our little community. Nothing too insane that locking down the hospital and calling in the big CDC hazmat guns couldn't handle. Boy, were we painfully mistaken. What started as barely contained chaos quickly devolved into a scene ripped straight from Dante's nightmarish visions of hell itself. These people, they turned into something no virus could mutate. Something abhorrent, inhuman, and nightmarishly violent. I remember wheeling this feverish college-age kid into one of the trauma rooms, his body convulsing so hard he had to strap him down like an inmate destined for a daytime TV's gnarliest medical freak shows. Within minutes, he was foaming at the mouth, eyes rolling back until only the blood-engorged whites were visible. Guttural, animalistic snarls reverberated deep from his chest as bulging veins pulsed across his sweat-slicked skin. Of course, we tried to sedate him. Actually, we basically drowned the poor kid in enough sedatives to dope up a fully grown elephant. But this wasn't your average manic delirium. The more drugs we pumped into him, the more feral and inhuman he became, fighting viciously against the restraints. That's when it happened. That first heart-stopping glimpse into the nightmare awaiting us all. His eyes locked right onto mine, teeth gnashing and unhinged jaws straining, tracheal muscles rippling as a gurgling howl of rage issued from deep within his throat. This hunger shone from his eyes, unholy and rapacious, like a starving predator scenting its next meal. Just for a split second, I saw the briefest flicker of cunning, focused lucidity, swirling beneath the bestial urges. It was just a fleeting instant, but enough to send icy tendrils of purest terror snaking through my veins. Next thing I knew, the kid was lunging forward with that same explosive force that first nutcase back at the ambulance bay displayed. Only this time, he came within inches of clamping those slobbering jaws around Javier's jugular before the orderlies managed to pry him back. That was our wake-up call. These weren't isolated cases of random viruses or bad drug trips anymore. This was the opening salvo of something far more sinister, the vanguard of an evil defying all realms of rational explanation. We were dealing with the unnatural, the unholy, the inhuman, and its hunger was growing insatiable by the minute. While a handful of brave souls stood their ground to confront the waking nightmare, most of the staff didn't stick around much longer to see what other fresh horrors this plague had in store. Who could blame them? Within hours, mayhem reigned supreme. Delirious patients were breaking free of their restraints, attacking anyone and everyone within biting distance like savage beasts. The screams echoing through these corridors still haunt my dreams, some of primal rage and bloodlust, others of sheer, pure terror and agony. It became impossible to distinguish victim from threat. People we've been trying desperately to treat and save were now turning on us, their eyes burning with that same rapacious hunger. That was the point I realized we were in way over our heads. By noon, even the cops were outmatched in full retreat. Chapter 3: Riverdale Falls. By mid-afternoon, Riverdale was descending into complete anarchy. What started as a few isolated cases at the hospital had erupted into a full-blown epidemic sweeping through the town like a virulent wildfire. The first wake-up call that this was no longer merely a contained medical situation came just after lunch. That's when the first panic calls started pouring into the emergency dispatch center from all corners of Riverdale. Disturbing reports of formerly healthy friends, neighbors, and loved ones turning unaccountably violent and delirious. At first, police were able to uphold some semblance of order, separating the afflicted from the uninfected population and transforming the disturbed individuals to designated quarantine sectors. But it quickly became apparent that whatever the nightmarish plague was, it spread with catastrophic speed. Within a couple hours, those original quarantine zones were overrun as once lucid people transformed into raging, feral shadows of their former selves. Law enforcement's resources rapidly became overwhelmed by escalating madness. I'll never forget the gut-churning sense of dread and gravity that settled over me when the first responders started going silent over the radio channels, their frantic last transmissions devolving into sheer panic and acts of unspeakable violence before abruptly cutting off. Officer down. Backup requested immediately. Civilian casualties. Shots fired. Those dreaded radio calls just kept on coming and coming, each one more harrowing than the last as the situation spiraled further out of control. That's about the time the good citizens of Riverdale took the prudent course of action and got the hell off the streets. Doors and windows were barricaded, families huddled in shelters, eyes glued to the television screens as the first disturbing images of the unfolding pandemonium began hitting the airwaves. I'll never forget the shocking footage of that SWAT team trying in vain to defuse a suburban hostage crisis 2 blocks from my own home. 1 second, the camera focused on the tense standoff outside a quaint ranch home with a neatly manicured lawn. The next, all hell broke loose in a blur of gunfire, blood, and inhuman roars as the deranged hostage takers turned on the officers with their teeth and nails. The video feed cut out just as one of those poor boys in blue crumpled to the ground. A demented assailant crouched over his still form, clawing and pummeling with unfathomable savagery. Jesus. I remember gasping aloud as the sickening realization hit me like a freight train. We weren't just dealing with some kind of rabies or drug-fueled psychosis here. This was far, far worse. These things, these people, they were becoming more beast than human, guided by the basest predatory instincts. It wasn't just mindless violence they craved. It was the sheer ecstasy of the hunt, the thrill of the kill, the rapturous frenzy of consumption that both terrified and entranced them. Zombies. Fucking zombies. Suddenly, all those campy horror flicks and apocalyptic sci-fi novels didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. I damn near pissed myself when it hit me. The sleepy town of Riverdale was under full-scale attack by the living dead. Those were the last coherent thoughts I can really remember having that first nightmarish day, besides getting out my buck knife and baseball bat to join the other stragglers fortifying our position around the hospital. Not that I held out much hope for any of us making it through the night, because that's when they came streaming out of the twilight shadows by the hundreds, former neighbors and friends reduced to soulless, snarling husks fixated solely on satiating their bottomless hunger for human flesh, and we were the menu du jour. Chapter 4. Last Stand. By nightfall, Riverdale General Hospital had become ground zero in the escalating war against the unnatural forces consuming our once peaceful town. A handful of staff and patients remained, hunkered down and fortifying every access point as a raging undead horde gathered in the gloom outside. From my vantage point on the roof, I can make out the first shambling silhouettes lurching across the employee parking lot shortly after sunset. At first, just a scattered dozen or so forms, aimlessly weaving between the cars like drunken partiers after last call. But within the hour, their numbers were swelling at an alarming rate as more streamed in from all directions, drawn by some inexplicable homing beacon. Hunger. That's all that ruled them now. A blind, rapacious hunger for their living that made even the most basic of animals look positively genteel in comparison. They were like great whites scenting a kaleidoscope of chum in the water, fixated on one singular drive. With more pouring in by the minute, we were quickly becoming surrounded and outnumbered by the seething, gnashing ocean of dead and decay. Every so often, one of them would catch sight of the flickering lights or movement from our makeshift rooftop lookouts, letting loose with a guttural, inhuman bellow that sent sickening shivers down the stoutest of spines. I could see their broken, distorted figures even from the distance. Eyes sunken and lifeless, taut flesh pulled back in rictus snarls exposing jagged rows of teeth, bodies contorted into slack, shambling forms. They weren't just soulless husks fueled by some base appetites. The walking corpses bore the unmistakable scars and death masks of friends, neighbors, and loved ones we had once known, twisted in their final moments of agony and terror. A butcher I bought Sunday ribeyes from most weekends, his trademark scarlet apron hanging in bloody rags. Mrs. Henderson, the sweet little old lady who used to hand out Werther's candy to all the neighborhood kids, her blue steel curls in wild disarray. There was even a couple of orderlies from the hospital lumbering among the horde, festering shreds of soiled scrub still clinging to their ruined frames. Poor bastards had been among the first to go, overrun on an early supply run when things started going to hell. I tried hard not to look upon their cracked, ashen visages I'd once called colleagues and friends. God only knew how many other familiar faces were lost in that shuffling, gnashing sea of death and decay. We kept a silent vigil while cold night breezes carried their inhuman groaning across the cracked pavement below. Our dwindling band of survivors gathered, what scant supplies and weapons we could scavenge. Bats, crowbars, knives, even a couple hunting rifles and leftover cans of bug spray rigged for makeshift flamethrowers. Not a single one of us uttered a word, fear and dread thicker than the gathering shadows around us. We'd all seen firsthand now what these things were capable of. The feral, ravenous strength, the cunning malice that lurked behind their dead, vacant eyes. Hell, I still had claw marks down my arm from an encounter earlier that day, the inflamed gashes burning like acid under my makeshift bandages. No matter how this played out, none of us expected to make it through the night unscathed. The only real reason now was whether we'd lived long enough to see the sunrise. It was Javier, that gruff, no bullshit charge nurse, who finally broke the silence with a voice as hard and steely as his gaze. "All right, listen up," he growled, drawing his battered K-bar from its sheath as he turned to face us all. "Way I see it, we've got two choices here tonight. We can either turtle up and wait for these freaks to bash their way in eventually." He let those words linger, allowing the distant snarls and banshee-like howls of the waiting undead to drive the point home. It was clear nobody held up much hope for holding up indefinitely against such overwhelming odds. Or, we can take the fight to them right now while we still got some chance of getting out of this shithole with our skins intact. Javier continued grimly. "I don't know about y'all, but this old dog's got some fight left, and I'll be damned if I just sit here and wait to get chomped like some cut-rate Alpo log." Chapter 5. Unholy Tide. Javier's words hung in the air, weighty with grim determination. For several long moments, the only sounds were the faint groans and rasping moans echoing up from the ravenous horde below. I could feel all eyes sizing me up, silently pleading for some voice of authority and reason. As the closest thing to a real doctor left standing, it fell to me to make the gut-wrenching call none of us wanted to face. Do we take Javier's insane Butch and Sundance approach, kick in the door and blast our way out in a blaze of glory against impossible odds? Or else barricade down, conserve what precious ammo and supplies remained, and pray for an 11th hour miracle that wouldn't reduce us to undead chow? Neither option held much promise for survival, if I'm being brutally honest. Yet there was a slim flicker of hope smoldering in my gut that wouldn't easily extinguish. Maybe, just maybe, a few tough bastards like us could find a way to slip through the cracks and live to fight another day. Outside these walls, the undead ranks had to peter out somewhere eventually as the plague burned itself out, right? We'd read enough accounts of zombie fiction to know the drill. Hole up, destroy the brain, and most importantly, don't get bitten at all costs. Those were the cold macro thoughts buzzing through my head as I bit my lip and scanned the battered faces around me one by one. What I saw was a ragtag pack of fighters and survivors, all with the same 1,000-yard stare. It was a gaze that accepted the gruesome realities of our situation, yet refused to surrender to them without a fight. Maybe our chances of busting out were slimmer than piss odds in Vegas, but giving up while still breathing, still burning our lungs, simply was not an option. In that moment, I knew we would rise and make our stand united, living or dying on our own terms. There would be no ignoble cowering or begging for mercy against this unholy tide of darkness and death. When the reckoning finally came, we would meet it head-on as warriors, swinging, biting, clawing with every ounce of savage desperation we could muster. I swallowed hard, mouth drier than cotton as I gave a solemn nod and steeled my resolve. All right, let's do this. A palpable wave of relief and renewed vigor rolled through the group as those four simple words, that steely glint of defiance, of sheer unbroken will, sparkled in every set of eyes. We were no longer lost, scared townsfolk in way over our heads. We were all soldiers now, unified against the endless night. Weapons were clutched tighter, stances shifting as adrenaline spiked through exhausted frames. I even noticed a few grim, wolfish smiles flash across battered faces. Not the fearful rictus grins of cornered prey awaiting slaughter, but the hungry snarls of predator eager for their shot at glory. We knew what we faced down there in the gloom. It wasn't just a soulless, rotting horde of mindless drones hungering for our flesh. No, this was the vanguard of a pure, unadulterated evil that had already consumed so many innocent lives. Yet, in that moment, there existed no fear or uncertainty, only absolute clarity of purpose. We would meet that unholy tide head on and sell our lives as dearly as possible, raging against the dying light until our very last wheezing gasp. Not one of us expected to see the sunrise, but by every god, saint, or deity that ever drew breath, the undead would be reminded that night just how ferocious the human spirit could burn. "Let's show these bastards how we do it in Riverdale," Javier bellowed, raising his blade skyward in a rallying cry that sparked a savage outburst of defiant roars. The zombies never knew what hit them when that rooftop access door burst open moments later. We came pouring out onto those tar-cracked battlements like the very wrath of heaven itself loosed upon these festering ranks. Chapter 6. Fury Unleashed. Our battle cry must have caught them by surprise at first. As we came pouring out of the rooftop axis like feral demons, I saw the first few rows of undead pause, swaying in stunned unison as if unified by some unspoken psychic shock. For the briefest of moments, the raging thunder of snarls and groans subsided into eerie stillness, like the calming of a stormy sea. Rank after rank, gaping up at us in slack-jawed, uncomprehending silence. Perhaps those glassy dead eyes simply could not process the concept of prey daring to show defiance, let alone mount an offensive. We were cattle boldly charging the slaughterhouse in their twisted, hunger-addled psyches. Then Javier let out his feral roar ripped from the very depths of his diaphragm, and all hell broke loose in a hurricane of fury. The sound was primordial, a rallying berserker cry that could shatter steel and splinter bone. It caused even my own heart to skip a beat before galvanizing every last ounce of rage shimmering in my soul. I added my own throat-shredding bellow to that chorus of unholy wrath as we surged forward like vengeful demons unleashed from the blackest pits. Bats, pipes, blades, and any weapon that could bludgeon, slice, or impale was instantly awash in viscera. The first few ranks of undead crumpled almost instantly under the ferocity of our onslaught. Shattered skulls and cleaved torsos sprayed rancid plumes of rot. Bones cracked like dry, kindling tendons and sinews, parting with sickening wet pops as we hacked and tore our way into the frothy frenzy. I lost all sense of individual identity in those opening moments, operating on pure id-driven impulse as my aching muscles pistoned and swung. All I could perceive were the rush of adrenaline, the metallic tang of blood misting in the air, and the feel of every impact driving through my arms to the core. At one point, I looked down to find myself gripping a shattered length of bone protruding from a twitching, eyeless skull, using it to bludgeon wildly at anything in my arm's reach. The acrid, fishy reek of putrescence clung in my nostrils, stomach rolling with every rasping gasp for breath between primal screams of exertion. I registered vague blurs of movement from my peripherals. A sledgehammer crashing through rib cages, a machete separating lower jaws from skulls and grotesque showers of spine and teeth. But the individual identities of their wielders were lost in the adrenaline-stoked melee. In those first few glorious minutes of unbridled slaughter, we truly became an unstoppable force of nature. Not even the mustering tides of the Black Plague or the rage of storm-tossed leviathans could hope to withstand our furious wrath. Fueled by the indescribable relief of releasing every pent-up ounce of terror and hatred, it seemed as if nothing could halt the cleaving wrath of our onslaught. I bashed and battered with reckless abandon, roaring like a mad beast each time another wretched foe crumpled beneath my flailing strikes. They just kept coming at us, those shambling, fetid ranks of hunger and decay. For a few euphoric minutes, my entire existence burned with the intensity of a raging solar flare. Fists mercilessly pounding anything that lurched within reach of my maddening swings. I wanted to rip, to tear, to utterly obliterate every last trace of this unholy evil from the face of the earth with my bare hands if need be. Once roused, our fury simply could not be contained or slaked until every last trace of the noxious corruption was scoured from this realm, which is why the soul-shattering sense of shock, of sickening realization, hit me like a blow from a sledgehammer when I finally paused to catch the briefest wisp of air and felt cold tendrils of dead creep up my spine. We weren't making a dent. No matter how many crumpled to the feverish swings of our makeshift weapons, no matter how many fell beneath our boots, endless ranks of shambling, groaning undead kept pressing forward from the gloom. For every half dozen that crumbled to our wrath, a dozen more took their place, swarming in with these same unblinking, hunger-stoked stares and gaping maws. Even Javier's raging, bestial howls began to falter, sputtering and choking off as a horrific realization dawned on us all. Our defiant heroism ultimately meant nothing against such boundless, limitless numbers. There was no way to stem this unholy tide, no path to victory, no matter how savage or undetermined. We traded grim, ashen glances across the sea of gnashing, clutching limbs, and I could see the fight draining from every other face. All the fear, the dread, the sense of despair we'd suppressed with our berserk wrath came surging back tenfold, threatening to drown us in a rip current of madness and utter hopelessness. From the moment those first blades and bats stopped raining blows, it was all over. Chapter 7. Endless Night. In the merciless seconds after our primal battle fury ebbed, a suffocating wave of dread and soul-crushing despair washed over us all. Even Javier's eyes, those granite orbs that had radiated such ferocious defiance mere moments ago, now betrayed naked terror as our flurry of pulverizing strikes slowed to horrified gapes. His hatchet-notched machete slipped from his slick grasp, clattering to the tar-cracked rooftop in a dull clang. I froze mid-swing, sucking in ragged gulps of the humid night air thick with the cloying reek of spilled rot and viscera. Corroded ropes of tendon and veins bulged obscenely from my forearms. The baseball bat gripped like a lifeline in hands that had long since gone numb from sheer exertion. Despite the unspeakable violence wrought by our makeshift weapons, the ranks of the undead seemed to swell and multiply with every tortured inhalation. Scores laid piled in mangled, twisting heaps at our feet. Matted clumps of hair and flesh adhered in chunks to our boots and clothing. Yet, the remainder just kept coming in ceaseless, indiscriminating waves. It was as if we cupped a handful of water from the ocean, only for the void to be instantly refilled. Worse, even our brief, glorious surge of indomitable defiance was swiftly flickering and guttering under the weight of such merciless inevitability. We were not warriors brazenly laughing in the face of death, but frightened, fragile creatures hopelessly adrift in an ocean of darkness without a single spar of driftwood to which we could cling. Despair and surrender seeped into every pore, extinguishing the valiant flames of our resistance. The first rank of low, guttural groans seemed to rouse my trance-like stupor. I glanced up just as the nearest undead figure began to regain their bearings. Those pits of lifeless hunger refocusing upon our dwindling knots of survivors with glassy inevitability. They sensed our flagging spirits, the ebb of adrenaline and wrath that had previously fueled our strikes. The yellow fangs gnashing with renewed vigor, long desiccated tongues slavering in fresh anticipation of the coming feast to be consumed. So transfixed by their unholy relentlessness that I failed to register the clumsy, loping footsteps closing in on my back. Not until rank, lukewarm splashes of vicious spittle began peppering the nape of my neck did the lurching shadows gain purchase of my peripherals. I whipped around just in time to see the mangled face of a former lab assistant mere inches from my own. Cavern of a maw agape in a horrid, eyeless rictus. Her gnashed teeth were stained a brackish black. Cracked and serrated by heaven alone knew what unspeakable fare they'd savaged and masticated. I recoiled with a choked cry, baseball bat instinctively whipping around in a ringing upstroke aimed at the reanimated corpse's temple. But my sweeping strike lacked the commitment and savagery that had fueled my earlier brutality. It was a limp, ill-timed swipe driven more by panicked reflex than by berserker rage. The bat shaft connected with a mushy thwack, skirting across flesh and cracking bone, but failing to truly cave the thing's skull in the manner required by a clean kill. It howled in pain and went into mindless frenzy, four slick claws outstretched and slashing wildly as it barreled forward. Acting more on instinct than conscious thought, I whirled away and bolted in a low crouch towards the edge of the roof. If there was any sliver of hope left, it lay in leaping the short gap to the adjacent wing rather than remaining trapped like a rat. As my boots thundered and skipped over the tar, sticky surface, the roars and gnashing snarls of the horde swelled from primal rumbles and full-throated bells of frenzied bloodlust behind me. I could practically feel their diseased, hunger-stoked breaths panting down the back of my neck as row after row of tattered figures scrambled and shoved forward, united as one slavering entity intent on devouring my very essence. Fueled by blind, unadulterated terror, I flung myself forward just as the first gnarled hands closed around the hem of my shirt. For a fleeting, harrowing second, I seemed suspended, mid-leap, between the two juddering wings, legs straining and body aching as I fought with every ounce of willpower against the inexorable, feasting drag anchoring me backwards. Then my boots struck the gravel surface, and momentum hurled me along with a clumsy, sprawling tumble. Above the frantic thundering of my heart, I could hear their howls of balked, seething outrage echoing across the night. Chapter 8. Into the Abyss. I crashed down hard on the cold gravel, feet scrambling for purchase as a strangled cry tore from my throat. Metal support beams and air conditioning units gouged mercilessly at my shins, palms grinding into coarse sediment as I tumbled in the ungainly leap. Palms grinding into coarse sediment as I tumbled in an ungainly heap. All around, the collective roars of the undead swelled in outrage at my brief, desperate escape. Skeletal arms shot through the narrow crevices separating both wings, gnarled fingers grasping and clawing wildly in gnashing frenzy. My hands scrabbled across the loose chunks of gravel, fingers splayed and grasping at every jagged pebble as I pulled myself away from those gaping maws of hunger. With gritted determination, I twisted back on my knees and heaved forward. Only then did I dare to glance over my shoulder. Rank spumes of curdled breath hit my face in dank, humid gusts as the foremost undead strained to worm their decaying husks through the tight space between buildings. Pits of voracious starvation stared back, dead glassy orbs burning with unbridled frenzy, unlike anything I'd glimpsed in nature. Watching those ravenous forms strain and squirm, pulling and shoving with single-minded hunger to push themselves through such a confined space, I was struck by a chilling realization. Despite their state of horrific decomposition, despite the fact their hearts no longer beat and their neural pathways were wrecked neurotic kindling, their soulless hunger, their rapacious drive to consume and obliterate all life, outstripped any instinct of self-preservation. These were mindless automatons, unmotored by any biological impulses other than pure, animalistic hunger. They weren't simply ravenous beasts confined to primitive patterns, hunting and devouring prey. No, this pestilence represented an unholy, profane force that elevated consumption of the living to the level of sodomastic mania, feeding purely from insatiable compulsion and ravenous joy. More gnashing shapes emerged through the breach, piling up like vermin trapped behind a crumbling dam. Their gnawing, cadaverous limbs lashed and grasped in a skeletal mass, scraping and chafing in their mind struggles to claim me as their profane prize. The ones in the lead were already slithering outwards, jaws snapping and agape in their mindless throaty bellows of gluttonous fervor. Threads of rancid spittle slicked the night air, stale and cloying like the last exhaled breath of a tomb left to molder across the centuries. I felt bile and nausea surge up my gullet, every instinct recoiled from such unremitted vileness. Yet I could not tear my gaze away, utterly transfixed by the ghouls walking my way. Ragged scraps of decaying attire clung to their skeletal frames and soiled, tattered rags. Sere patches of wispy hair and desiccated skin hung in leathery drapes from sunken sockets and open lesions. In the rictus visages of a few, I thought I glimpsed the barest hints of former identities. An agonizing twist of mummified lips, proud swell of musculature, only to be swallowed up by the horrific, grinning reverence they had been subsumed into. These were no sluggish, lumbering incarnations of mindless plague. No. This unholy scourge moved with a loping agility completely divorced from any preconceptions I'd anticipated. Their heedless fury to pursue and violate our living refuge betrayed a depraved cunning, a malicious sentience that somehow lingered in those rot, slick craniums despite the ruin otherwise manifest. It was the barest glimpse of recognizance, of higher function, and still with the only most profane and sadistic of drives. I steeled what tattered reserves of courage still fluttered in my breast, blinking back the sting of sweat and despair that clouded my vision. Death, in its most unhallowed and grotesque incarnations, closed in all around. I would not meet it pitiless, insatiable grasp lying prone and cowering like a babe. No, like my compatriots before me, I would rise to face its slavering jaws on my feet with all the stoic defiance and unwavering resolution I could still muster. My limbs quavered faintly at first, an earthquake tremor gathering momentum through weary muscle and sinew. Then, with a harsh exhalation, I forced myself upright in a low crouch, gaze sweeping the rooftop precipice before me. There were more of them than I could accurately count, a gnashing, writhing press of rot and starvation surging ever closer with each wheezing inhalation of courage. Yet, even if I could somehow summon the constitution to combat such inhuman hunger directly, what then? Already, the wretched tide that had spilled through the main horde surged across the roof, fanning out in every direction to cut off any line of retreat. With the ranks massing behind and on all sides, escape was rapidly becoming an illusion. My gaze fell to my powdered, stained skid mark of a trail, measuring the longest vector before me to the crumbling precipice perhaps 50 yards ahead. If I could somehow break through to that edge. The sudden frenzy of renewed snarls and throaty bellows from my rear shattered the moment of stillness. Like cockroaches scurrying from a shaft of daylight, the undead picked up the scent, wheeled, and surged forth in my direction with supernatural vigor. There was no choice, no weighting of options or evaluation of odds anymore. Only the instinctive imperative to run, to flee, to keep moving with every gasping iota of life that still animated me. So fixated was I on that distant edge, that the razor-thin possibility of finding sanctuary from this nightmare, that I was already churning forward before conscious thought could intervene. My battered boots skidded and scraped over the loose, gritty surface, picking up ragged plumes of silt that hung in the humid night air. Both arms pumped like a man half my age, while straining, blood-scorched breaths heaved for my breath. Behind, a singular tide of damned rapture and starvation followed, untiring and implacable in its festering pursuit. If I looked back even for a second, I knew my remaining will to flee would implode, so I fixed my vision straight ahead, legs churning mechanically with every ragged, burning gasp for life. The gravel-strewn expanse stretched out into shadow-swathed eternity, but I could feel the cold caress of rushing wind whistling past as the edge drew nearer. Just a few more strides. Nothing else mattered beyond that next staggering step. Not existence, not the concept of hope or meaning, only the oblivion promising sweet escape from the all-consuming hunger swelling behind me in a seething, gnashing tide. Then, with an almost casual suddenness, the toe of my boot hung suspended over empty space for the barest fraction of a second. Reality slammed home in a soul-shattering instant as the gravel abruptly ran out and my forward momentum hurtled my body into freefall. Even as I pitched forward, my own ragged, disbelieving scream joined those triumphant howls of hunger in the infinite night. Chapter 9. Oblivion Embrace. The piercing wail tearing from my throat mingled with the hungering roars echoing up from that festering tide of damned pursuit. My screams stretched towards an endless eventuation, like plunging into a vast dark abyss with no bottom. For an indeterminable, frozen sliver of eternity, I was suspended, weightless and adrift in a void untethered to any physical absolutes. All corporeal sensation bled away until my entire existence distilled to the purest essence of raw consciousness. My mind's eye beheld the full, horrific culmination of my flight through that single, fragmented snapshot. I hung delirious and endless, no longer falling, but borne aloft on the currents of wretched compulsion and fear-given form. A banshee scream ripped through dimensional boundaries, cast forth by some primal psychic force. Then, as if obeying some stricken cosmic directive, the gravity-defying current shifted and pulled me under and away from that singular, frozen flash of nightmarish intensity, frozen in perpetuity. Only in that bizarre, intangible periphery did the truth linger, bleeding from the corners of my very soul. I was reminded in sickening flashes that this was waking mania. This night of grim delirium was just a flicker, an echo of itself, reverberating down through the warped prisons of perception that filtered this horrific reverie. Within the sweeping, almost nostalgic rush of insight, I beheld the Riverdale incident in its totality. Not merely the frantic series of physical events already witnessed, but the true scope and scale of its festering taint. The maddening, fractured picture expanded into infinity on all those diverging vectors of unholy momentum unleashed. Some streams of shambling, hunger-soaked atrocity branched outwards in rapid dissolution, dissipating wakes consumed by their same virulent excess, swallowed back into a swift oblivion with nothing to check their unbridled tide. More frequently, those frantic spasms accelerated exponentially until every fabric of reason itself came apart at the seams in a tumultuous hurricane of pure pandemonium. There could only be the briefest flashes of merciless hunger distilled into reckless abandon unleashed, and the awful primal cacophony of resolute chaos ravening outwards into the unrelenting, all-encompassing delirium before each vortex collapsed into itself. Reality itself could not withstand the onslaught. And there were many, too many dark vortices breaching the membranes, the sudden irrational nodes of violent ignition that flared up and propagated like the most virulent bushfire imaginable, each hemorrhaging their profane contagion into communities, neighborhoods, and towns until the entire state stood burning under their mindless, rapturous din. They all blended into one frothing singularity of mania, gnashing itself almost dimly fluorescent streets and vacant highways, leaping and skittering across rooftops as the entire region was torn asunder, throat shredding and ragged, transmitting itself like a radioactive shockwave flaring outwards as radio broadcasts and early emergency siren wails of warning abruptly dissolved into sheer static and howls of suffering. That crescendo peaked like an inflating pustule when the fires flashed out amidst the dying squalls of feedback, and the last mournful refrains of the opening salvo began to play. With every nerve slicked in the anguish, I bore witness to the unholy cacophony erupting from Riverdale into crystalline focus. The screams of that first, terrible gale of anguish and desolation echoed through streets awash and rivulets of ruin. The delirious wails of the tormented went through barricaded homes and burst from makeshift strongholds like cannon fire. Windows and doors ruptured into shards, or issued echoes of no less horrific violence, all cohesion lost under the growing clamor. Louder, so much louder than any conflagrated resonance of woe, more shrill even the keening grief of 1,000 innocents with their last breaths. A singular, sustained bellow that carried on the fevered winds. The baying exhalation of pure strife too intense for any throat to cough up, except the wellspring of the most unfathomable anguish. The shattered wretched souls no longer struggled to survive, but crying out their despair to the heavens themselves, united in one voice stripped of any pretense of individuality by the hopelessness inflicted upon them by this unholy deliverance. Filling their eyes for the end, disgorging tongues dangling obscenely to keep from choking the bitter, brackish spumes lancing from their parched throats, vomiting forth guttural expirations of defiant rage and malice to their profane reckoning, the final haunting legacy of a populace shattered against an endless, onrushing tide of madness. The shriek of damned spirits ripped from the final reserves of a civilization plunged in eternal darkness. The dire pronouncement of its awful finish. Chapter 10. The final chapter. Echoes of the Damned. With reality folding in upon itself, I remained trapped in that holy singularity of madness for what seemed an eternity, yet was just the faintest, infinitesimal speck within the infinite churning chaos. My own tattered screams joined those of the eternally tormented, adding to the cacophonous cyclone that raged through every fissure and warped perception of existence. Yet, even as my very existence thrashed and fragmented within that waking nightmare, jagged slivers of cold clarity managed to penetrate the delirious storm. For scattered instants, my consciousness fractured away from the raw insanity, casting fleeting glimpses from outside its frenzied vortex before being swept up once more. In those 2 brief moments of lucidity, I beheld the aftermath of Riverdale etched in scorched afterimages. The utter havoc and civilization-shattering ruin visited upon the surrounding region in the plague's wake still burned across my field of perception like scars gouged into my psyche. Those images filtered between the chaos unleashed and the tomb-like silence of its passing in saccadic flashes. Farm fields and rolling hills stained crimson with blood and viscera out to the horizon line. Shopping malls and sleepy subdivisions reduced to bombed-out shells littered with half-devoured corpses and smoldering pyres of the damned. Children's playgrounds standing empty and desolate, all sanctuaries long profaned and rendered to little more than sacrifice pits. And even then, cut off from the cyclone's ravening chaos, the echoes of its maddening chorus refused to subside. Wails and howls of unfathomable anguish carried on the scorched winds like flayed spirits in perpetual torment, as though the rage and depravity inflicted still clung to every facet of the blasted landscape. What should have been the moans and cries of the dying instead felt like the land itself had been rudely stripped of its innocence and defiled, its very essence reaping the consequences of an unholy transgression. It was as though the entire region stood bereaved and desecrated by whatever apocalyptic force had been unleashed upon it, as if the living earth itself had been the true casualty, left horrifically ravaged, with only the frayed remnants of anguish to keep it company until the end of existence. In my tormented fugues in and out of the madness, I could feel the agony transcending physically, seeping into my core until even the most hallowed and unbreachable sanctums of my soul felt pilfered and defiled. No shelter from the gnawing starvation, no asylum from the relentless tide of rapture that coursed through this dead land. My throat itself felt raw, yet still I raged and railed against the howling mania of the infinite tempest. Sensory input degraded into pure, cyclonic torture as my fragile grasp on consciousness frayed thread by agonizing thread. Nothing but the endless screaming as all matter and energy collapsed into a singularity of anguish. Until at last, stillness. Emptiness swallowed all sensation in one yawning, merciful grasp as the insidious howl of oblivion swept in to smother the final fading echoes, consuming the madness whole. Just like that, the shrieking vortex blinked out, its chaotic cyclone of despair snuffed out in an instant. One final rush of pure entropy sucked every last tendril of torment from the existence, leaving nothing but the cold vacuum in its wake. As the last flicker of what fragile sanity remained slipped away in the void of non-existence, I felt a profound weariness overcome me. Not a physical exhaustion of the body and mind, so much as a bone-deep spiritual fatigue, which penetrated every layer of being. A tattered fragment of consciousness drifted, unbound and utterly spent with the stagnant void. There could be no more struggle, no lingering instincts of fight or flight against the oblivion's embrace. Only the sweet disillusion of self into an endless, formless drift without pain or suffering. As my sense of self ebbed fully away into absolute stasis, even those last whispers of awareness detached from the mortal vessel and disassociated into nothingness. The anguish finally ended as I became one with the void, at long last achieving the absolution of oblivion. In the end, the screaming stopped only when there was nothing left to echo in its abject dissolution. And so the cycle would turn once more, with peace and silence reigning until the next profane ripple sent forth their agonizing cries to fracture the placid stillness. But that endless dance between fury and fading, between oblivion's cold caress and existence's rapturous fever lay ahead in an eternity far beyond my shattered perception. For now, there was only the void, and within its fell embrace, that singular respite of absolute nothingness. Well, that felt like it went off the rails pretty quick. I am actually not sure what is going on there at the end. I'm like reading through it and it just felt like a word salad. Okay. As I was reading it, this is kind of what I pulled from it. At least it seemed like it to me. It sounded like she jumped from the roof onto something else, right? Bear with me. And I'm assuming at some point she was bitten or infected somehow, because it sounds like the last two chapters, it seems like she's turning. She's becoming a zombie, and she's like joining the hive mind. She's able to see what's going on with the rest of like the zombie legion. This is at least what I'm thinking it is. I am hoping that's what it wanted to actually get across, because otherwise it was just like raving crap for like the last two chapters. I really wanted to test the limits of the like the free version of Claude for this. At least 10 chapters is a long time for an AI to remember to do so, like to remember to stick to something. I think this ended up being like an hour's worth of like recording, so I'm not sure what that looks like when it's fully edited out or how long it's going to be, but I mean that's a lot for an AI to remember. um so I think the moral of the story is, at least for this, is I think it's good if you want to write some short stories. I think it did pretty good in the beginning. It's a little wordy. That was my biggest problem. It was like way too wordy. I don't know. It just sometimes it felt like it felt the need to just explain everything way too far out. But honestly, let me know how you guys liked it, what you thought of it. It's a cool story. I like the idea of there being kind of like a last stand at the hospital. Um, and this story kind of ends like most of my stories that I write, and they all end on like a sad note. Like this didn't end well for the protagonist. She's dead. At least that's what I took from it. She's a zombie now, along with everybody else in the hospital that she was with. Yeah, it's kind of sad actually, but I hope you enjoy the story. Yeah, thank you for listening as always, and remember to face your fears.